In August 2017, Sega unleashed Sonic Mania upon the world. The game was a 2D platformer made to replicate the gameplay and feel of the Sonic games from the early and mid-1990s, complete with remixed versions of old stages, all new stages, and even a fresh coat of paint for old characters. Upon release, Mania would go on to be the most critically acclaimed Sonic title in over 2 decades. Sega traditionally relied on their in-house Sonic team to develop Sonic titles, especially major releases. However, Mania was developed by a team not of industry veterans, but rather of lifelong Sonic fans who had cut their teeth by creating fan games and ROM hacks in their spare time. The two most famous of them, in the Sonic fan community at least, Christian Whitehead and Simon Thomley. Whitehead rose to fame with the creation of his Retro Engine, which could replicate the look and feel of classic Sonic titles, along with his popular fan game, Retro Sonic. He would begin working with Sega for official Sonic projects, beginning with the 2011 revamped re-release of the 1993 game, Sonic CD. Thomley, or as he is known online, Stealth, was also a rather prominent member of the Sonic ROM hacking and fan game community. Arguably, he is one of the fathers of this section of the Sonic fandom, with his earliest attempts to create a Sonic game of his own beginning in his youth. In the early 90s, after first experiencing the original Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis via display at a local Sam's Club store, he became obsessed with this franchise. Enamored with the fast, momentum-based platforming of the title, he would attempt to recreate Sonic's style of platforming himself, first using his parents' Apple II computer, and later a PC running Microsoft DOS. Today we're talking about a Sonic project that began as one of Thomley's earliest. Sonic the Hedgehog Project Mettrix is a fan title that Thomley worked on from 1997 to 2016. This is his story through this game. Thomley's first game was called Hunt. A primitive title created by a 12-year-old Thomley in 1991, this Apple II game featured a red rectangle, which had to be moved through a variety of puzzles. It was a rudimentary platformer, taking some obvious cues from Super Mario Bros. The rectangle itself could not even jump, but rather could only be moved vertically by crude rectangular elevators. As basic as Hunt was, it was a start for Thomley, who had initially become fascinated with programming as a child, cutting his teeth on computers such as the Texas Instruments TI-99-4A. By 1996, his programming skills had grown exponentially. He had become proficient in the programming language C, and had tried numerous times, albeit unsuccessfully, to create a Sonic game of his own with his friends. He had become gripped by Sega's mascot. However, unlike most, it wasn't the character itself or Sega's in-your-face marketing tactics that had drawn Thomley in, but rather Sonic's gameplay. Sonic the Hedgehog was a game which relied on not only a player's mastery of level layouts, but also of momentum and the physics of the game's world. Also in 1996, Thomley set up one of the early homes for the Sonic fan community online, the Sonic Stuff Research Group, or SSRG. This became a hub for ROM hackers to share their resources, tools, and projects. It was through his work on the SSRG that Thomley would become among the first to experience unreleased prototypes of Sonic games, such as the Simon Y Sonic the Hedgehog 2 prototype, which included references to and playable sections of levels that would not make it into the final release of the game. Enter Ron Echidna, or as she would later be known, Amy. Much like Thomley, she had a desire to bring the Sega Genesis Sonic experience to the PC. However, she had run into some issues. Her own project, at the time titled Sonic and the Seven Rings, was being developed using a rudimentary game development tool from Click Team called the Games Factory. After running into numerous issues, many of which were caused by the constraints of Click Team software, Amy searched out a programmer who was proficient in the C programming language, and who was also interested in creating a Sonic fan game. In 1997, she stumbled upon Thomley. He seemed like a perfect fit for her project. What initially began as a project of simply porting Sonic and the Seven Rings from the Games Factory to C, instead became a much more involved project for Thomley. Shortly after joining Amy on development, the project was retitled to Sonic the Hedgehog Project Mettrix, mainly just due to that title sounding better to those involved. At this point, a plot for this title had not been decided upon, as emphasis during development was placed upon gameplay over all else. The main inspiration, gameplay-wise, was Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles. This had been the final, biggest, most grandiose Sonic adventure on the Sega Genesis. Thus, a build of Mettrix was created featuring Sonic the Hedgehog, Tails the Fox, and Knuckles the Echidna, all playable and nearly identical in control to their Sonic 3 and Knuckles counterparts. The small Mettrix team soon realized, however, that they were in fact going to need some sort of story. Even if it took a back seat for the majority of the adventure, they felt a need for some sort of reasoning for these characters to be going through the wide variety of stages and situations. A few different stories were drafted. Though never intended as a Sonic the Hedgehog 4, these plots all took place directly following the events of Sonic 3. The earliest plot featured the evil Dr. Eggman discovering a machine which would grant all of the planet Mobius's animals with super intelligence. Somehow, through a means which was never agreed upon by Amy or Thomley, Eggman would build and re-engineer this machine to instead turn the animals into robots. The name of this nefarious contraption? The Mettrix. However, the plot that was ultimately settled upon was more par for the course for a mid-90s Sonic game. After somehow escaping unscathed at the end of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Dr. Eggman would once again build up a robotic army and set off to the mysterious floating Angel Island, home of both Knuckles the Echidna and the mysterious yet powerful Master Emerald. Instead of wanting the Emerald to power up his Star Wars-inspired Death Egg like in Sonic 3, Eggman instead hoped to build a machine of nearly unspeakable power, capable of not only destroying Sonic and friends once and for all, but perhaps the world itself. The device was codenamed by the Mad Doctor as Project Mettrix. Like in many 2D platformers, the plot here was rather simple. As per the team's wishes, it served merely as a reason for why Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles had to traverse through a variety of zones in order to defeat the evil scientists in question. In addition, Mettrix expanded on the concept of different characters taking different paths through the game, which had been introduced in Sonic 3. For example, the player would begin each adventure in Wood Zone, an area based off a scrapped level from Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which served as a glorified character select. From there, if the player chose Sonic or Tails, they would go through the lush Shining Island Zone. However, if Knuckles was selected, they would instead go through Guardian Castle Zone. This was one of several points in the game where different characters would experience their own exclusive stages. Despite being a DOS game, the levels here have a very Genesis-esque look and feel. Everything is vibrant and colorful, and this is bolstered by a strong MIDI soundtrack by Andre Schroeder. Most importantly, especially in later builds, characters control flawlessly. Despite having some noticeable bugs, Project Mettrix was debatably the best fan-made Sonic experience out there in the late 90s. In 2002, however, development on the project was slow. Around this time, Amy mysteriously disappeared from the internet, leading to most, if not all, development at this point being handled by Thomley. This would be further slowed by him taking on other projects in addition to Mettrix. Around this time, during an attempt at porting both the original Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic 2 to the Sega CD, Thomley would learn of the Sonic ROM hack Sonic the Hedgehog Megamix, which had begun as a simple palette and level edit of Sonic 1. He would join this project and co-found its development team, Team Megamix, in 2004. From here, the project would shift to become more of a complete overhaul of the 1991 title, eventually featuring new graphics, music, and characters, and eventually even itself being ported to the Sega CD. Upon the departure of the original lead, Thomley would find himself in the leading position here. Megamix would soon begin to take up much of Thomley's free time, though work did continue on Mettrix. Amy briefly returned online in late 2004 with a renewed interest in the project she had begun in 1996. She would help create new levels, mainly the prehistoric themed Bronze Lake Zone, and even helped prepare a build of the game to be released for the 2005 Sonic Amateur Games Expo. She would disappear again shortly afterwards. This was the last of her involvement with Mettrix. However, progress on Project Mettrix was continuing again, though Thomley was not completely satisfied. He had decided in 2003 that the original DOS engine was just not up to snuff with what he ultimately wanted to accomplish with the project. Thus, he began working on a new game engine, known as EO2, alongside the old version of Mettrix. He rechristened the old versions of the game as EO1. The final EO1 version of Mettrix would be released around 2005. It was the most stable and complete version of the game yet, even if not everything Thomley had wanted. All 3 characters were playable, each with their own functional paths through the game. In addition to this, the last EO1 versions of Mettrix would finally see ports to Microsoft Windows. Despite this, due to the non-standard screen resolution of the title, the game will not run properly, if at all, on modern versions of Windows. Thus, the best way to experience EO1 Mettrix in all of its glory is by using a DOS emulator, such as DOSBox. From here, Thomley hoped to create an even bigger, better version of the game using his EO2 engine. In 2006, the first build of this new version of Mettrix would be released for the Sonic Amateur Games Expo. Consisting of only a few playable levels, this build was meant to show off the power, stability, and versatility of EO2 itself. The Sonic community was impressed by this game engine, especially once Thomley also released a Mega Man 7 style fan game demo titled Mega Man Triple Threat, which also ran using EO2. The Mettrix EO2 build would not change much in the coming years. Consisting of a fully functional version of Shining Island Zone, Act 1 of Bronze Lake, a remake of Green Hill Zone from Sonic 1 and the Sonic 1 special stage, plus a test zone along with all 3 playable characters from previous versions of Mettrix, Stealth would turn his focus from porting the entirety of Mettrix to EO2 to instead porting EO2 itself to a variety of systems. By 2008, in addition to Windows, EO2 and Project Mettrix would have versions compatible with Mac OS X and Linux as well. Soon after, homebrew versions were also made available for both the Sony PSP and Nintendo Wii. In 2009, this EO2 porting job would gain Thomley the attention of Christian Whitehead. Whitehead and Thomley had previously met in 1997, after Whitehead had discovered an earlier version of Mettrix. They had since fallen out of contact, though Whitehead had kept up to date with Thomley's work. By 2009, Whitehead was working on an updated re-release of Sonic CD, and wanted to make a demo version to pitch to Sega themselves. However, versatile as his retro engine was, he wanted Thomley's help in getting the demo to a point he was comfortable with on smartphones. In particular, he wanted help in getting the game's pseudo 3D special stages faithful to the original versions, in addition to other aspects such as the Palm Tree Panic Zone boss, which was the first boss of the game. An agreement was made, and Thomley got to work. Within a year, Whitehead's pitch had been made and accepted by Sega. Upon the release of his version of Sonic CD in 2011, it was met with critical acclaim. Thomley, however, would not work with Whitehead on this project after the initial pitch demo. Though he would initially try to join Whitehead on developing the port past this point, Whitehead would decline, citing lack of experience or existing relationship with Sega at the time. This didn't stop Thomley from coming up with his own idea to pitch to Sega. In his free time, he had created his own demo version of Sonic CD, which ran on the Nintendo DS. Unfortunately, due to a variety of external factors, he never got to make his own Sonic CD pitch. Fortunately, Thomley would get a chance to work with Sega again a few years later. Whitehead, after the critical and commercial success of his version of Sonic CD, was going to make an updated version of the original Sonic the Hedgehog for iPhones and Android devices, but he wanted Thomley's help. Thomley agreed. Thomley had established his own game studio in 2011, named Headcanon, and this was the name he would work under for this project. This version of Sonic 1, released in 2013, would also receive critical and commercial acclaim, and would be followed later that year by a similarly styled port of Sonic the Hedgehog 2. In a move that harkened back to Thomley's earlier work, the smartphone release of Sonic 2 featured a fully playable version of the Hidden Palace Zone, which had been playable in prototype versions of the game, but was scrapped from the final original release. Throughout this time, work continued off and on Project Mettrix. With the registration of Headcanon in 2011, the EO2 engine itself was renamed to the Headcanon Game Engine. However, the final update to the Headcanon Game Engine, which a download of was required to even play Sonic Mettrix, would occur in April 2016. This was shortly after Thomley famously canceled the Sonic Megamix project, of which he was also the only development team member left on. In his final post on the official Team Megamix blog, He cited part of the reasoning for this cancellation as involving various upcoming projects. He did, however, also state that he would someday release the Megamix engine to the public, after he had time to go back, clean it up, and improve it to a point that he was satisfied with. In July of that year, Sega officially announced Sonic Mania, a new game which would serve as a celebration of the Sonic series itself. It would feature new levels, old levels, classic Sonic gameplay, and even references to obscure and widely forgotten Sonic titles. To put it bluntly, it was equal parts a new Sonic game and a celebration of the franchise as a whole. This title would be successful enough to garner an updated release, titled Sonic Mania Plus, in July 2018. One of the prominent team members on the Mania project was Thomley. While Sonic Project Mettrix was never formally cancelled, it can be assumed to be on an indefinite hiatus. However, the game itself, both in the later EO1 versions and the EO2 demos, is a blast to play and is definitely worth your time. As for Thomley himself, his story shows what happens when you take something you're passionate about, in this case Sonic the Hedgehog in game development, and stick with it. From a young age, he didn't just want to recreate the Sonic experience, but rather actually contribute something to his favorite franchise. With Sonic Mania, he was finally able to do this. He had gone from Sonic fan to part of what is considered to be one of the best official Sonic games of all time. However, the work he would go on to do on Sonic Mania, indeed with Sega in general, would not have been possible without the work that was set in motion by Project Mettrix. This is part of Thomley's story in the tale of an extraordinary fan game. If you would like to learn more about Thomley and his work, read the companion article to this video over on infinitefrontiers.org.uk, and also tune in to the Stuff We Say podcast, where Thomley and myself sat down to discuss his work, fan games, Sonic itself, and more. And of course, check out his own channel where he currently creates his own videos. So with that, thank you very much for watching, subscribe and share this video if you found it interesting, and I hope to see you next time.